When push came to shove, it was the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu who blinked first. For months, Netanyahu had been the main obstacle to a ceasefire, to the frustration of his own negotiators. More than 2 months ago, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant resigned on this issue. The chief architect of the 15-month war, Gallant said plainly there was little left for the army to do in Gaza. But still, Netanyahu persisted. Last spring, he rejected a deal signed by Hamas in the presence of CIA Director William Burns in favour of an offensive on Rafah. In the autumn, Netanyahu turned for salvation to the general's plan, aiming to empty northern Gaza in preparation for resettlement by Israeli settlers. The plan was to starve and bomb the population out of northern Gaza by declaring that anyone who did not leave voluntarily would be considered a terrorist. It was so extreme and so contrary to the international rules of war, it was condemned even by a former defense minister, Moshe, as a war crime and ethnic cleansing. Key to this plan was a corridor forged by a military road and a string of outposts cutting through the centre of the Gaza Strip from the border to the sea. The Netzarim corridor would have effectively reduced the territory's landmass by almost 1/3 and become its new northern border. No Palestinian pushed out of northern Gaza would have been allowed to return. No one from Biden's administration forced Netanyahu to rethink this plan. Not the US President Joe Biden, himself an instinctive Zionist, who for all his words kept on supplying Israel with the means to commit genocide in Gaza, nor Antony Blinken, his Secretary of State, who earned the dubious distinction of being the least trusted diplomat in the region. Even as the final touches were being put on the ceasefire agreement, Blinken gave a departing news conference in which he blamed Hamas for rejecting previous offers. As is par for the course, the opposite was the truth. Even Israeli journalists who covered the negotiations reported that it was Netanyahu who rejected all previous deals and was responsible for the delay in coming to this one. It fell to one short meeting with US President-elect Donald Trump's special Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, to call time on Netanyahu's 15th-month war. Both Biden and the incoming Trump claimed responsibility for the breakthrough, but it was the Qataris and Egyptians who hammered out the deal, with Biden covering Netanyahu's back every single time he walked away from it. But it was Trump's no-nonsense approach that pushed this whole wagon over the line. Netanyahu will try to paint this as a victory, or cast maximum doubt on stage 2 of the deal, in which the real meat of the ceasefire and the painful parts of the withdrawal of Israeli troops will now take place. But retreat, plain and simple, is staring him in the face, and it's not been lost on the Israeli commentariat. There's no need to sugarcoat the reality. The emerging ceasefire and the hostage release deal is bad for Israel, but it has no choice but to accept it. Yossi Yehoshua wrote on Ynet, "The ceasefire agreement is clear in stating that Israel will pull back both from the Philadelphia corridor and the Netzarim corridor by the end of the process, stipulations Netanyahu had previously rigorously rejected. Even without this, the agreement clearly notes that Palestinians can return to their homes, including northern Gaza. The attempt to clear it of its inhabitants has failed." This is the biggest single failure of Israel's ground invasion, and it's sinking into Israeli public opinion that the war is ending without any of Israel's major aims being achieved. Netanyahu and the Israeli army set out to collapse Hamas after the humiliation and shock of its surprise attack on southern Israel in October 2023. They demonstratively haven't achieved this goal. Take Beit Hanun in northern Gaza as a microcosm of the battle Hamas waged against invading forces. 15 months ago, it was the first city in Gaza to be occupied by Israel, who judged it to have the weakest Hamas battalion. But after wave upon wave of military operations, each of which was supposed to have cleansed the city of Hamas fighters, Beit Hanun turned out to have inflicted one of the heaviest concentrations of Israeli military casualties. Hamas kept on emerging from the rubble to fight back, turning Beit Hanun into a minefield for Israeli soldiers. Since the launch of the most recent military operation in northern Gaza, 55 Israeli officers and soldiers have perished in this sector, 15 of them in Beit Hanun in the past week alone. If any army is bleeding and exhausted today, it is Israel's. The plain military fact of life in Gaza is that 15 months on, Hamas can recruit and regenerate faster than Israel can kill its leaders or its fighters. One retired Israeli military commentator said, "We are in a situation where the pace at which Hamas is rebuilding itself is higher than the pace than the Israeli army is eradicating them, Amir Avivi, a retired Israeli brigadier general, told the Wall Street Journal. He added that Mohammed Sinwar, the younger brother of the slain Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, is managing everything. If anything demonstrates the futility of measuring military success by the number of leaders killed or missiles destroyed, it is this. In a war of liberation, the weak and vastly outgunned can succeed against overwhelming military odds. These wars are battles of will. It is not each engagement that matters, but the ability to keep on fighting. In Gaza, it was the determination of Palestinians to stay on their land, even as it was being reduced to rubble, that proved to be the decisive factor in this war. And this is an astonishing feat, considering the 360 square kilometre territory was entirely cut off from the world, with no allies to back it up to break the siege, no terrain for cover. Neither enforced starvation, nor hypothermia, nor disease, nor brutalization or mass rape at the hands of their invaders could break their will to stay on their land. Never before had Palestinian fighters and civilians shown this level of resistance in the history of the conflict, and it may yet prove to be transformative. Because what Israel has lost in its campaign to crush Gaza is incalculable. Israel has lost not only the global south, it has lost the support of a whole generation in the West whose memories do not stretch back as far as Biden's. The point was well made by Jack Lew, the man Biden nominated as his ambassador to Israel a month before the Hamas attack, and who has not uttered a word of criticism about the Gaza war in his tenure. In his departing interview, Lew told the Times of Israel that the public opinion in the US was changing. Lew said that the memory of Americans of this generation no longer went back to the founding of the state, or the wars, or the intifadas. It starts with this war, and you can't ignore the impact of this war on future policymakers, Lew said. Gaza has become the prison through which a new generation of future world leaders sees the Israel-Palestine conflict. Lew's parting shot is amply documented. More than 1/3 of American Jewish teenagers sympathize with Hamas. 42% believe Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, and 66% sympathise with the Palestinian people as a whole. This is a major strategic loss for a country that on the 6th of October 2023 thought it had closed down the issue of Palestine and had the world in its pocket. But the damage goes deeper than this. The anti-war protests, condemned by Western governments first as anti-Semitism and then legislated against as terrorism, have created a global front for the liberation of Palestine. The movement to boycott Israel is stronger than ever before. Israel is in the dock of international justice as never before. Not only are there arrest warrants out for Netanyahu and Gallant on war crimes and a continuing genocide case at the International Court of Justice, but a myriad of other cases are about to flood the courts everywhere where Israeli soldiers travel. The Israeli army recently decided to conceal the identities of all troops who participated in the campaign in Gaza for fear that they could be pursued when travelling abroad. A ceasefire in Gaza is thus not the end of Palestine's nightmare, but the start of Israel's. Regionally, the ceasefire leaves Israeli troops in Gaza, Lebanon and Syria. It would be delusional to think that Israel has restored the deterrence it lost when Hamas struck on the 7th of October. The 15-month war has set the region aflame, and Israel need not do much for another conflict to break out. Israel's undisguised bid to divide Syria into cantons is provocative to Syrians of all denominations. Its plans to annex areas B and C of the West Bank are an existential threat to Jordan. Annexation will be treated in Amman as an act of war. Deconfliction will be the patient work of decades of reconstruction, and Trump is not a patient man. With the enormous cost in lives, every family in Gaza has been touched by loss. But what Gaza has achieved in the last 15 months could well transform the conflict. Gaza has shown all Palestinians it can withstand total war and not budge from the ground upon which it stands. Gaza tells the world that the occupiers threw everything they had at them, and there was not another Nakba. Gaza tells Israel that Palestinians exist and that they will not be pacified until and unless Israel talks to them on equal terms about equal rights. It may take more years for that realization to sink in, but for some Israelis it already has. Columnist Yair Asulin wrote in Haaretz, even if we conquer the entire Middle East, and even if everyone surrenders to us, we won't win this war. When this conflict is finally over, Gaza may yet prove to have been the key battleground around which this long war has turned. What everyone in Gaza has achieved is of historic significance.